That was one insane new trailer for Tears of the Kingdom, and I have to say, it is so good that it seems like even the most skeptical of Zelda fans have started turning around, and now just about everybody is starting to get hyped for this new game. And I have to say personally that I only feel more and more reassured the more I learn about this game, that they are really starting to address some of the criticisms of Breath of the Wild, as well as building upon its strengths, to really try and one-up themselves over what was already an amazingly highly rated game. And of course, speaking of sequels, this video is a follow-up to my last video that I made before that trailer came out, talking about how I think that Tears of the Kingdom might address some of the complaints that various people had with Breath of the Wild. So I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description and various other things if you want to check out that video before returning to this one. But before we go diving into all the new stuff that we've seen in the latest trailer, I actually have a few more thoughts on how they might be changing the durability system with that new fuse ability. There's some interactions that I hadn't considered before with how I think they might be improving upon the system to kind of help reduce some of the frustrations that some players had with it, while still not removing it entirely, as, like I said before, I do believe that these games are better off with weapon durability in them than if you simply wholeheartedly remove them. And these theories are actually based more on what they haven't shown us more than what they have. For example, they haven't actually shown us fusing two of the exact same weapon yet, and I'm curious if that may have some kind of special interaction. They did show two weapons of the same type being fused, such as the long stick and the pitchfork, which are both long thrusting weapons, and they were able to fuse that to make an absurdly long, like 20-foot long thrusting weapon. But I'm curious what if instead of a long stick, they had fused an actual pitchfork with another pitchfork? Would that still just create the same double-length lance-type weapon? Or might it do something different, like, say, repair the pitchfork? I could see that being a really simple and intuitive way to repair weapons. If you find another weapon of the same type, simply fuse them together, and now instead of making some weapon combo, it just repairs the durability. And I could see that being expanded even further as some kind of upgrade system. Like, maybe it adds together the durabilities into a new total that might be further than the maximum durability of the base weapon. And to another extent, maybe if you fuse two fully repaired weapons, I could see that creating some kind of upgrade system, where you could see some of the random upgrades that you would get later on in Breath of the Wild applied to your weapon. Though, even if this repair mechanic isn't actually implemented into the game, there is still another idea that I am curious about how it works in the actual game, and that is how a fused weapon breaks. They've shown normal weapons breaking, like when they demonstrated the stick breaking early on, but they only showed that the stick plus the boulder had more durability by just having it last longer. They didn't actually show it breaking. So what I'm curious about is how exactly a fused weapon breaks. You might think it just breaks all at once, and that could very well be the case. But an interesting alternative could be if the secondary weapon that you fuse to the main weapon that you're holding actually breaks first. They could have some kind of system where the secondary weapon's durability is what gets used first, and then when that runs out, only the secondary weapon breaks, and then you're still left with the primary weapon that you were holding in a pristine condition. This could allow players to essentially preserve weapon types that they prefer by having other weapons glued on to absorb the durability from them. For example, when we see that weapon combo where they use the shield attached to a greatsword, that might allow you to essentially just still use it as a greatsword, but have the durability be absorbed by the shield so that you can keep using that greatsword for much, much longer. And then even when the shield breaks, you can simply reapply another shield or some other item to the weapon in order to keep absorbing the durability and thus keep using that weapon for even longer. On top of course, any other benefits that you may get from the fused weapon, like how we saw them be able to block with the shield while still using it as a sword. But of course, as I said, this is all entirely just speculation. But if I were designing the fuse ability and incorporating it into the weapon durability system, I feel like these are the kinds of ideas that I might have when trying to improve upon some of the complaints that people levied towards Breath of the Wild. But feel free to let me know in the comments how plausible you think these ideas are and how much you like them, or maybe some other ideas of how the fuse system might work with durability. But without much further ado, I think it's about time that we got into some of the juicier details that have been revealed in this latest trailer. So right off the bat, I feel like the biggest thing that people have taken away from this trailer right away is that it's pretty much all but directly confirmed that we will be getting a significant underground presence in this game. Some kind of system of tunnels or caves or some kind of entire underground realm in a pseudo-dark world sort of fashion. Something along those lines must exist in this game, and I think that that's very interesting and how it might address another big critique of Breath of the Wild that I didn't really bring up before my last video. You see, another very valid criticism of Breath of the Wild is simply how different it is compared to past Zelda games. Now, that isn't necessarily a good or bad thing on its own, and you can still love Breath of the Wild and have this criticism, because even if you love Breath of the Wild to death, if you also love classic Zelda games like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess and the like, well, this game just simply isn't that, and it doesn't really provide much of the same experiences that those games did. And what I think that they can do by emphasizing these underground areas, as well as the Sky Islands to another extent, is sort of try and merge these linear and open world design styles. You see, the past Zelda games were kind of open in some areas, but when you got to the real meat of them, you were going through very linear and curated experiences. The dungeons generally had a way that you were intended to approach them, and you weren't really very flexible in how you could modify that approach, outside of a few special circumstances. And I think the same is true of just the inherent nature of an underground area. As I talked about in my previous video, the ascent ability at best can only allow you to leave the underground areas. You can't use it to enter them, which means that the only way into these areas are going to be the fixed predetermined cave entrances, or whatever various things that you use to get underground, and thus you'll be forced into a very specific way of navigating these passages. Now, of course, they can still open up fairly significantly. It does look like some of these areas are fairly large, but at the very least, it provides the same sort of design space to have a more linear, curated experience, kind of like the shrines as well as the classic Zelda dungeons. And of course, by theming it this way, it also seems like it'll have a lot more variety in their theming and styles and their puzzle layouts compared to the shrines, since the shrines were all ultimately using the same pool of assets over and over again, which kind of made them a bit repetitive and boring to look at after you had done them a few dozen times. And that may still hold true for the underground, since I imagine it's going to be a lot of brown stone and rocks everywhere, but we've already seen quite some interesting appearances in these trailers alone, and who knows what they're not showing us on top of that. And on top of that, there's also the fact that I believe the Sky Islands can share a similar sort of design philosophy. I think that the way that they're going to be structured is that the way you get to a Sky Island will be relatively open. Like, you can probably rewind a lot of rocks to get up to a good number of them, or you can maybe build a contraption that flies you up to one, or climb a mountain and then glide off of it to get to a Sky Island. I'm sure there's dozens of ways to get to the Sky Islands, which can build off of that open world formula very well. But then once you're there, they have this very small fixed area that once again they can curate and design a much more linear experiences, kind of like how the shrines worked, and of course, like classic Zelda dungeons. So I think that both the underground and the sky are going to try and represent the sort of merging of design goals between the open world and linear elements. You'll probably still be able to do almost all of them in virtually any order and approach them from a number of different angles to start, but then once you get to the meat of it, then it'll kind of funnel down into a more linear experience, and maybe that can help appease both sides of the fandom on this particular issue. But of course, beyond just the locations we see in the trailer, we also see some interesting enemies populating those locations. And I'm of course talking about what are almost certainly going to be some new bosses that we'll be encountering. We see that giant flaming Gleeok on the bridge that we spotted in the distance earlier. We see some giant looking constructs that clearly get their own cutscene or something. And we of course even see rehydrated Ganondorf and possibly even a powered up form of him on top of that. And that's just what they're showing in this short little trailer. I think that the main takeaway is, of course, that we're going to be getting some much more interesting and varied boss fights than we got in Breath of the Wild. Because, of course, another big complaint about Breath of the Wild is that a lot of the bosses looked very samey. They had some unique abilities and whatnot, but they all looked like they were basically just the same sort of creature wielding different weapons. And so as a result, even if they were technically different bosses, they all just kind of felt very samey, and that was disappointing for a lot of people, especially when the final boss themselves, the weird mutated form of Ganon that we fight, sure, it was super creepy to look at and made me very uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, it still had the same sort of vibes as all the Ganon Blights, and so as a result, it just didn't really feel that unique. Whereas right off the bat, people are already swooning over the new Ganon design, and I think that having Ganon be an actual character and a real antagonist in his own right will make him a much more interesting character on the whole, and of course a much more interesting boss fight, presumably at the end of the game. Which was, after all, one of the other complaints that I didn't really bring up, which was that there wasn't really the proper antagonist in Breath of the Wild. I mean, yes, you had the weird floating cloud that was Ganon, but he really was more of just a force of nature that you were fighting against. It didn't really feel like you were fighting a person, because, frankly, you weren't. Whereas this might allow Ganon to take a much bigger role in the game, and possibly even show up multiple times throughout the game's story. I could see him appearing as a boss fight throughout different chapters of the game, and perhaps instead of it just being one big boss at the end that you're trying to take down all at once, I could see there maybe being multiple boss fights they have to go through, which happened in a lot of older Zelda games as well, and that could make for a much more interesting antagonist, given that he is voiced, and thus could have a much bigger presence in the story, which actually brings me to another one of the big complaints of Breath of the Wild. You see, a lot of Breath of the Wild's story, well, it already happened before you played the game. What I mean is that a lot of the story is simply backstory for the state of the world as it is now. You're mostly going around collecting memories and learning about what already happened, which is incredibly non-interactive. You're not really participating in the story, you're learning what has already transpired. Now, there are some events that actually happen in the modern day, usually with the new champions, but that's really about it. There's not much beyond that for the actual main storyline. And so, I'm hoping that Tears of the Kingdom has taken this kind of thing to heart as well, and might include a lot more active of a storyline in the present day. Now, it is still possible that they'll flash back to some ancient events, and maybe that's what that Zonai dragon-looking character might be involved in, but we also see them interacting with Zelda a lot, implying that there's some kind of modern-day connection happening. And I think that it's very likely that we'll be seeing a lot more modern-day events, because after all, we've already seen the backstory of the world in Breath of the Wild. There's no real reason why they need to show it again. Sure, they could show, say, the calamity from thousands of years ago, and kind of do some repeating, and they could also do that and still have a lot of modern-day story events. But I think that based on what the cutscenes that we've seen so far, it seems like a lot more is going to be happening in the modern day. Especially when you consider the interactions that we've already been seeing with the NPCs as well. And that is something that I think that it's less about trying to nullify a complaint, and more about building upon one of Breath of the Wild's strengths. Outside of the main story, there were some fun and interesting NPC interactions. I think Terry Town is a notable standout, where not only were you going on this massive quest that took you across pretty much all of Hyrule to all the major factions, but you were also building up this small village that was added to the map, and you got to see it grow and change over time and become a thriving community. And that was really interesting and fun and made it really feel like you had an impact on the world. And I think that they might be expanding upon these ideas into a much grander scale based off of the variety of really cool and interesting NPC interactions that we've seen so far in just this final trailer. We see things like Link ferrying people in some kind of clearly custom-made carriage that allows them to transport the NPCs from one location to another. I could see that being an entire kind of quest where you have to transport one group from one side of the map to another side of the map using whatever materials you can find to build a suitable vehicle for them to ride on, and then of course having to protect them along the journey. We also see things like fighting alongside the champions and even other random NPCs, which could make things really interesting for defending a town. You might be in a town just shopping around, suddenly the blood moon hits, and now everybody has to take up arms. Now you fight alongside them to protect their village. That could make for some really interesting moments, especially if failure actually has a consequence. Imagine if a shop can get destroyed or something like that, and now you have to help them rebuild and kind of fix things up to restore things to normal order. And even if nothing's that dire, I have to imagine that these battles have to have some real weight to them in some form or another, because not all of these NPCs can be completely immortal, or else it will trivialize those fights. So that could really give you something interesting to fight over. And of course, interacting with the champions more is something that I think a lot of people will really like. I mean, especially when it comes to Sidon, because let's face it, you know who you are. But in general, those were some of the most fun characters in the game, and yet we only got to see them for their fairly limited quest lines. Outside of those quests, they basically stopped existing in the story, and that was a little disappointing. So now, if you're able to take them along with you and have them fight alongside you for extended periods, because it doesn't look like Prince Sidon, for example, is only fighting in Zoro's domain. In fact, he looks like he's on a floating island alongside you. So I'm curious if you can actually take these kinds of NPCs on extended journeys, kind of like companions in an Elder Scrolls game or something like that. And that could make for some really fun interactions, because they might even be able to show up in cutscenes and the like. Maybe this is a little bit of wishful thinking, but I just think that that could make for some really cool aspects of the game, because even if it's not part of the main story, that can give you a lot more possible character interactions, kind of like things like how various party members would talk to each other in the elevators on Mass Effect. It wasn't like that was a huge story thing, but it helped the world feel that much deeper and more connected with all those casual conversations. And so if you're going to be able to have all of these NPCs traveling with you throughout your adventure, you're probably going to be able to talk to them a lot more and have them interact with the world around you and vice versa, which could make for making the world feel that much more alive. Not to mention that a very obvious use for Ultra Hand could be an expansion on the Terrytown concept itself. I could very easily see a questline where you are physically building a town using Link's new abilities and constructing things like homes and shops to turn things like Castletown, which we see as just a pile of tents, into a thriving community like we would have seen in older Zelda games. And if you're able to do that across multiple different locations with some sort of theme of rebuilding these cities and rebuilding their communities, that could make for a really interesting experience where, once again, the player has a huge effect on the feel of the world. And of course, these are things that would happen on the main overworld. The underground and the sky islands are useful for new content and new things to explore and discover and adventure through. And then the overworld could be about rebuilding these civilizations to their former glory, and that could be a really interesting way to sort of remix the overworld so that it doesn't feel stale, because it is up to the player to build it up and really expand it. But I must admit, I am starting to veer a little bit further into the speculation territory than I probably should, so I should probably call it there for now. But I am curious what you think of my analysis, and whether you think that Tears of the Kingdom is actually going to be addressing all of these weaknesses of Breath of the Wild while building upon its strengths. So feel free to continue the conversation in the comments. If you liked what you saw, make sure to leave a like, and if you want to see me analyze the design of more games, past, present, or future, feel free to stick around with a subscription. Until next time, thanks for watching.